Hi everyone, I'm Susan Mulvihill. Boy, do I love growing green beans. That's the topic for today, and I have some wonderful tips to share with you. Even though I enjoy growing both bush beans and pole beans, I especially love growing pole beans. They are so much easier to harvest because they're up at a higher level and they're very prolific. Now, several years ago, I got the idea of growing them up and over a pathway in my garden. And I'll tell you what, I have never looked back because this has worked so well. What we did is we got 4 trellises or arbors, and they are spaced a few inches apart. They're about 6.5 feet tall, which is a little tricky sometimes, but fortunately the beans hang down. And they are 46 inches wide, which works really well for our 36-inch pathways. They are about 14 inches deep. These work so great because as the beans grow up and over the pathway, I get to stand in the shade in the heat of the summer when I'm harvesting the beans. I just love this method. You could use a cattle panel too, which you get at farm stores, and put it up and over a pathway. This is slick. I start my seeds indoors about 10 to 14 days before it's time to transplant them out into the garden. That way I get a jump on the season, and also it's a great way to get really good germination because of those controlled conditions indoors. Also, because I have a lot of birds in the garden, they love to peck at freshly sprouted seeds. So this is a way to really get them off to a great start before moving them out into the garden. So let's go plant the seeds because I've got a really great tip to share with you that you might not have heard before. My favorite pole bean variety is Musica. I saved a whole bunch of seeds from last year because I'm absolutely crazy about them. They're very flavorful, incredibly productive, and they freeze really well for eating later. So here is my tip about planting all kinds of bean seeds. If you look closely at any bean seed, you'll notice there's kind of a scar on the inner edge where the seed curves inward. So here's one, here's one, here's one. This is where the seed will send a root down and a sprout up. This is very important. Think of a seed as being a little packet of energy. If that scar isn't pointing down, the seed has to use its energy to orient itself correctly. And a lot of times it will run out of energy and fail to sprout. I learned this tip many years ago, and it has made a huge difference in the germination rate I get. To plant the bean seeds, I use something called a deep root flat insert, and there are different types of flat inserts that have pretty good sized cells. I'm looking for something like that because bean seeds are large and their root systems are large. So something like this works really well for the beans. Whenever I start plants from seed, I always use what's called either a germination mix or a seed starting mix. It's very light and fluffy, it is sterile, and you should avoid using garden soil because that compacts easily. It's hard to keep the seeds evenly moist, and also it could contain disease pathogens. So what I have done is I've filled this bucket with seed starting mix, and I have lightly moistened it just to get started with filling the flat with some soil. I have filled each of the cells in this plant insert about halfway with the seed starting mix, and that is in preparation for planting the seeds. And I have compacted it down with my finger in each cell just to make sure that it's a good amount of soil on the bottom. Remember that each of the seeds gets planted with that scar facing down. This is so important, and it makes such a difference. Obviously, if you were a farmer growing fields and fields of beans, this would not be an option. But most of us are planting such a small amount of beans that it's not a big deal to look at the seed before putting it into the insert. Now you can see that all of the seeds have been planted. There is 1 seed per cell, and each seed is planted 1 inch deep. The next step is for me to finish filling in the individual cells with the germination mix or seed starting mix. I'm going to water everything in, and then I'm going to place a very light layer of finely milled sphagnum moss on top, and that is to prevent a nasty fungal disease called damping off. If you look closely, you can see where there's a little bit more of that finely milled sphagnum moss on here, and I'll tell you what, it works great. In all the years that I have been using it, I have never had an instance of damping off syndrome. That sphagnum moss naturally inhibits the development of the fungus. It comes in a bag. You can just get it at a garden center, or if your garden center doesn't have it, ask them to get some. And I'll tell you what, a little lasts a long time because I've had the same bag for ages. One of the things I wanted to point out real quickly is that this insert is inside of a flat that does not have any drainage holes, and that's so water doesn't get all over everything. Then what you want to do is put either a clear plastic lid or a clear plastic bag over everything, and that is to increase humidity so that these seeds will germinate. Now, most seeds do not require any light in order to sprout, and that includes beans. But once they're up, you definitely want to give them all the light that you can. So I'm taking this inside, and once they're sprouting, I'm putting them under a grow light. If you don't have a grow light, don't worry, you can put it in a sunny window and the plants will love it. But once the majority of the seeds have germinated, then it's time to take off this lid and let them grow. So let's give it a few days and then we'll take it up from there. It's been 10 days, and as you can see, the beans are definitely up. As a matter of fact, they need to go in the ground right away because they're already sending up little vines. So I'm going to give you a couple of tips and show you how I plant them. Whenever I take plants out of a container that they've been growing in, I am so careful with how I handle them. You never want to grab a hold of a stem and just yank it out of the pot because that's really hard on the plant and it can even kill it, and you certainly don't want that. So instead I use this little slot screwdriver, and what I do is I slip it into the outer edge of the cell that the plant is growing in, and then I gently lift it up. And there's a nice seedling with a lovely root system. Now to plant them, I'm using a tool called a dibble or a dibbler, and you just press it down into the soil and it makes a lovely cylindrical hole. You don't have to have one of those tools, but I sure like using them. So then carefully put this into the hole and press the soil around it so that there are no air pockets around the root system. So let's get this guy into the ground. Here's the second one, and the same drill. Just carefully push the soil around it and firm it into the ground. So now I need to get this whole flat planted. All of the beans have been planted. I spaced them about 3 to 4 inches apart, and that's because pole beans are going to grow up and not out. If you're planting bush beans, I'd recommend a good 6-inch spacing between the plants. Now I'm going to water them in to make sure that they're all well hydrated, and also to make sure that I have eliminated any chance of air pockets around the roots. And then I get to stand back and watch them grow. Happy gardening!